So this presentation is going to be the first part of chapter 26, which covers the end of the Indian Wars out west. So, the clash of cultures on the plains. Following the Civil War, white migration pushed into the Great Plains. We'll go over some of those, what brought them out there later, but as they spread out west, disease spread among the Native American tribes, and also bison disappeared rapidly. Now, many tribes out west relied on that bisons for their survival. So, as whites pushed out west, they naturally kind of came into conflict. The U.S. attempted to make treaties with them, including the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Fort Atkinson Treaty of 1853. Don't worry, probably not going to ask you to remember those. But what this did is it began the reservation system. Native Americans agreed to go to reservations to avoid conflict, and the Americans to promise not to interrupt them. The problem is we misunderstood Indian culture. The chiefs did not speak for the entire tribe, so although some chiefs may have made those agreements, they did that believing that their entire tribe would be left alone, but also chiefs were not exactly, speaking for everybody. So many members of the tribes would reject that chief's decision and continue living on their life as though that treaty had not been made. This reservation system also was completely unfair to Native Americans. The government promised them food, money, and solitude, but none of those things appeared. In fact, the Indian agents who were supposed to deliver their food and deliver their money often kept it for themselves, which led to Indians struggling, and to survive, they had to leave their reservations. Combine that with the fact that many of the reservations were overrun by white settlers, including one we're about to talk about, where gold was found on the reservations. So the Indian Wars actually begin as Indians are frustrated that their decisions and agreements aren't being met, or what we agreed upon wasn't being met. So the Indian Wars, some big examples that are brought up throughout our history is 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre. 400 Indians attempt to surrender, and unfortunately, they are absolutely slaughtered by the Americans who had brought them under pretenses of negotiating. The Sioux naturally respond to this event by mutilating 81 soldiers in Wyoming and attacking wherever they had a chance. So, as these Sioux organize against Americans, more agreements are made, and the Sioux go and rest on the Black Hills. But what happens before this Battle of the Little Bighorn is the Black Hills, which were supposed to be reserved for the Lakota Sioux, and it was their reservation. General Custer and his group discovers gold. He announces it, and white settlers naturally rush in because of the promise of, well, quick profit. Unfortunately, this broke the agreement, and that leads to the Sioux going on the warpath. Custer decides to attack the Lakota Sioux. The problem is that he attacked. Now you'll see on my slide it says 250 men is what he had against 2,500 Indians. I've seen that he had 700 men against 7,000 Indians. Regardless, when he attacks them as they're gathered together discussing what the Sioux want to do to address the issues. As he attacks them head on, they quickly surround his force, and he is slaughtered. The U.S. government responds to this by rounding up the Sioux, Nez Perce, which is another tribe out west, the Apache, and many other Indian tribes. The military force was available because Reconstruction had just ended, and so they kept those soldiers occupied and moved them out west to solve our issues out west now that Reconstruction was done. So this military force, the infringing on their settlement, railroads also cut into their land. The near extinction of the buffalo pretty much brought an end to Plains Indian culture. This map shows the many different battles that occur, and you also see the flight of the Nez Perce Indians. They tried to run away and escape, and they almost made it to Canada, but you can see there at the Battle of Bear Paw Mountain, 1877, that they did not reach freedom, and they were forced to go back to a reservation. Geronimo also was a famous Native American who fought valiantly and pretty violently against American control as well. So, end of the trail, talking about exactly how it comes to an end. When is the last battle, and when do we consider all of the Indian Wars done? You would guess from the last slides that it was over, but it's not until 1890, the Battle of Wounded Knee, that we see the end of this. Now, many Americans did feel guilty for this treatment. Helen Hunt Jackson even writes a book, A Century of Dishonor, chronicling government cruelty and lies. And it should be noted, I think sometimes people want to look back in our history and say that all Americans stood for things that our country does, but it's simply not true. Just as not everybody supported or was against Donald Trump as president, just like not everybody will be supportive or against Joe Biden as president. So these actions that we take in the past towards Native Americans wasn't supported by everyone. So with that said, most Americans did want Native Americans to assimilate into American culture. We wanted them to become Americans and give up on their way of life and become just like us. But the problem is that they did not want that. So Christians are able to convince the government to ban the Indian ghost dance. It was a violation of our beliefs, we thought. And also, the ghost dance was terrifying because they would dance around a fire. And when this is spotted by a settler near the Lakota Sioux territory, he understands this to be, in his mind, them rising up, preparing to attack. Now, what the ghost dance actually was, according to the Lakota Sioux, was they wore brightly painted vests made of animal fur, and they would dance around the fire. And this was supposed to bring about a massive wave of soil that would cover all of the Americans. All the whites would be gone, and the world would go back to how it was before whites arrived. At the Battle of Wounded Knee, that is the government's reaction to this ghost dance and the fears that it had incited. It is called a battle in your textbook, but most have called it the Massacre of Wounded Knee because what happens as those Native Americans are surrendering their weapons, a gunshot goes off, and suddenly the American military surrounding that village of men, women, and children began firing indiscriminately into the crowd. Your textbook says 200 plus Indians. Other sources say 400. Either way, Indians are killed as they attempted to surrender here. Did they fire a shot intentionally? Did a gunshot accidentally go off? Just like the battle at Lexington, it doesn't really matter because the effect is felt. So many have called this a massacre of Wounded Knee, but what it represents, as you can see from this picture, from the pictures that follow, so this is supposed to be them receiving the rations, and this is sadly their bodies being buried in a mass grave following the massacre at Wounded Knee. But what this Battle of 1890 does is it ends the Indian Wars once and for all. No longer are any Native American tribes out west resisting. They all are forced to accept their way of life out west. And after this is done, actually in 1887, an act called the Dawes Severalty Act is passed. And the Dawes Act, as you can see, I have it underlined, bolded, and a few stars around it, which means it's a very significant event for Native American history. So from the beginning of our country, we've been migrating west, coming into conflict and pushing them further west. And now that we finally have control over all of our land and they are locked in one location, what the American government wants to do is have them assimilate into our culture, and they do this by dividing Indian reservations into 160-acre plots. The effect this has is first, it ruins tribal culture. You divide them not by having a shared amount of land um, and having a tribal identity, but now you divide them into families. So it just undermines what they had always operated as. Furthermore, and this is the most damaging thing to them, the surplus land is given to the U.S. government. Now, the idea is, as we'll cover later in the Homestead Act, they believed all Americans should settle on 160-acre plots. Their families should be happy. They can be farmers. And they thought that the Native Americans would be happy with the same thing. The problem is they did not want to be farmers. A lot of these tribes out west were nomadic or relied on buffalo. They didn't want to settle down and be farmers like normal American. And so a lot of these Indians end up selling their land. Uh, this map or this depiction here shows you exactly how much land shrinks following the Dawes Act. You can see in 1790, this is without many treaties at all signed. The majority of the land in the United States would be owned by Indians. By 1860, you can see that we've settled the West Coast and a good bit of the Great Plains. Then in 1880, as the battles rage, you see where it is. But in 1890, that is after the Dawes Act takes place, you can see just how much land was taken away from those Indian reservations. And then furthermore, by 2000, you see even more lost by them. Look at Oklahoma itself. Nearly all of that land is sold off and given away. So, all this in mind, this is the end of the Native American battles and wars. From here out, Native Americans are going to have to struggle to become citizens, which is a long way away to have any kind of equal rights. It's not till the New Deal in the 1930s that the Dawes Severalty Act and some of its worst parts are stripped away. So many children are forced to go to Indian schools, leave their culture and religion behind. And so through the Dawes Act and through these Indian schools, you see a forced assimilation on Native Americans. Truly a sad end to just an unfortunate, truly terrible interaction between Americans and Native Americans from the beginning. Anyway, so this kind of wraps up the Native American theme from early American history of taking over all the land. We've now settled it all. And again, on this map, you see exactly where the Native Americans have been sent. Okay, and hope you enjoyed it as much as you can enjoy something that is a horribly depressing topic and fairly shameful in American history. But if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them to me, and I'll answer them. Bye.